Hello and welcome to the Bio 122 video lectures. This is video 23 from chapter 40 on the circulatory system. And today's topic is going to be types of circulatory systems. So when we look at circulatory systems across different animal species, we see that some animals don't actually have a circulatory system. Generally, the same ones that don't have a true digestive system. Um, animals like the cnidarians and animals like the flatworm that we've seen quite a bit that have only gastrovascular cavities, and for their digestive system and respiratory systems rely on simple diffusion, and therefore they don't need a circulatory system in order to transport substances. But again, this is going to be restricted to animals that have a very thin structure. They can actually be quite large, like the jellyfish, but jellyfish are just a dipoplastic organism that only has a few cell layers thick going through it, thus allowing diffusion to all the cells. Or they have to be very small, like the planarian flatworm that we have studied quite a bit. But for most animals, as you become larger, um, the circulatory system becomes important so that we can transport nutrients and gases and also recover waste. There are two major categories of circulatory systems, though. One of them is called an open circulatory system, and the other one's called a closed circulatory system. Let's start first with the closed circulatory system because this is what humans have, and it's what you're probably most familiar with. It's closed because the blood is contained continuously within a series of blood vessels. There will be a heart to pump the blood, but the blood remains within arteries, capillaries, and veins traveling through the body. The only place that you actually get diffusion of nutrients, gases, and waste products is actually in the very, very thin walled um, capillaries. So this is called a closed system because the blood never actually leaves the circulatory system. And this is present in humans, but even here in the example of an earthworm. There is a closed circulatory system, and earthworms actually have multiple hearts, um, a main heart and then several auxiliary hearts. And it becomes very efficient at transporting fluids because we can maintain a fairly high pressure to move the fluid through the system. The alternative system is what's known as an open circulatory system. In this case, we still have a heart, so there will be a pumping chamber and there are blood vessels, but the vessels actually open up into the extracellular environment. And therefore, we don't refer to it as blood. We have a particular term for this called hemolymph. So hemo does mean blood, but lymph means fluid. So the body fluids and the blood are just all actually the same, as opposed to a closed circulatory system where the blood is separate from the extracellular fluid that surrounds cells. The cells in an open circulatory system do receive the nutrients coming out of the blood vessels, but it's more just kind of like, as in the case of insects here and a grasshopper being shown, it's almost like a sprinkler system coming from the ceiling, is how I'd like to think about it. And so from this point on, it's actually really no pressure. So there's no fluid pressure directing the movement. It really becomes diffusion as you leave the blood vessels. So the open circulatory system is just a small step up from a very simple diffusion system. It's kind of intermediate as far as efficiency goes. So insects and many mollusks we'll have a open circulatory system, but we're going to concentrate most of our time talking about closed circulatory systems. So within the closed circulatory systems of vertebrates, we actually have several types. One type is typical of a fish, and we'll explore each of these in detail. But this is a figure from your textbook showing the difference between a fish, an amphibian, a reptile, and a mammal. And we'll look at each of these one at a time. So let's start with the fish. And this also allows us to demonstrate that within the closed circulation group, there's actually two subdivisions of this: single circulation and double circulation. Single circulation is what you see in fish. So we'll start off with the fish. This is in all the bony fishes, so vertebrates, and also the rays, like manta rays, and the sharks will all have this type of circuit, where it's called a single circuit because it starts in the heart here, where the heart only has two chambers. So blood comes into the atrium. Atrium is the entryway, and then there's a ventricle, and deoxygenated blood comes in, and color-coded blue, the deoxygenated blood from the body comes into the atrium. Not right or left, there's only one atrium, so we don't need to determine right or left here. Goes into the ventricle, and then the deoxygenated blood is then pumped out. So there's high pressure going into the artery leaving the heart. And our first stop is going to be the gills. So we studied the gills in the respiratory system, and we saw that that is a very efficient mechanism by which we can extract the limited amount of oxygen that's present in water and oxygenate the blood. So the only place that we actually get diffusion occurring is in capillaries. So these capillaries are in the gills. So we oxygenate the blood, and then we come back together into a single blood vessel, or a few blood vessels that then leave the gills with oxygen-rich blood that then travels out through the rest of the body, and therefore delivering oxygen to all the body cells, to the muscles, to the nervous system, all the things that need oxygen. Again, as to branch out into capillaries, and then that's where our exchange of all nutrients and waste products occur, and then we join back together into a vein, and we start the cycle over again. So notice it only passes through the heart once each trip through the body, so that's why it's called a single circulation. So characterized by a two-chambered heart, and while it only enters the heart once, it actually enters, each blood cell will enter two separate capillary beds, one in the gill, one in the body, on the way through its trip. Compare that to what all non-fish have. So the double circulation is present in amphibians, reptiles, and mammals. And here we have the blood entering the heart, so there will be an atrium, and we will always have two atrium in a double circulation. We may or may not have two ventricles. So there's both 3 and 4 chambered hearts, but there's always going to be two atrium and either 1 or 2 ventricles, depending on the species. The blood here coming in to a truly separated heart with 4 full-fledged chambers goes into the right ventricle, that then propels the blood, exerts pressure on it, moving it to now the pulmonary circuit. Instead of having gills, these are going to go to lungs, and we're going to oxygenate the blood. But now, instead of going directly to the body from the lungs, as in the fish, it goes directly from the gills to the body, we have a double circulation, so the blood leaves the lungs and goes back to the heart. but goes to the left side of the heart so that we can repressurize the blood. And then the blood becomes much more pressurized and we can deliver it throughout the rest of the body. This allows us to resist the force of gravity much better, which fish don't have to worry so much about. But also for very, very large animals like giraffes and elephants, there's a long way that we have to transport the blood against the force of gravity. The blood then goes out to the body, to where all the muscles and all the somatic cells are, exchanges the gases, exchanges nutrients and waste products, and then comes back. So notice the blood will pass through the heart twice on each circuit of the body, therefore it's called a double circulation. However, as it leaves the heart, it will only pass through one set of capillaries before returning to the heart, because we have two separate circuits, the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. This has a great advantage because it will maintain much higher blood pressure throughout the circuit for greater efficiency. So you're going to see this in the land-based animals and the birds, reptiles, all of those type of species. So let's look at a few examples of double circulations. So amphibian, reptile, and mammal have three different variations on the double circulation. So here we're looking at the amphibian, and the amphibian, if you remember, we looked at them in the respiratory section of the class. And remember, they are the ones that are able to breathe through the skin. So they have, instead of a pulmonary circuit, a pulmonocutaneous circuit, so that blood can be shifted between a very rudimentary lung they have. So they do have lungs, but they're not as efficient as other land-based animals. But they do have this ability to breathe through their skin when they're submerged, and therefore only having a portion of the back available above the water. In order to shift the blood efficiently back and forth between going to the lungs and going to the skin, they actually only have one true ventricle. So there's two atriums, but one true ventricle, because there's no separation between the left and right side of the ventricle. This allows the blood to be shunted away from the lungs and bypass it and just go straight out to the body again. This becomes important because it does allow us to continue movement of the blood through the body and extracting every last bit of oxygen from it, even when the animal may be submerged, and we can therefore partially shut off the lungs. It does have its inefficiency because it allows oxygenated and deoxygenated blood to mix within the heart. So there's always some deoxygenated blood that can bypass the respiratory system and just go right back out to the body. But it has the advantage, again, because it allows a transition between the land and the water fairly efficiently. Now, you're going to also see this in an animal, like an amphibian, that has low metabolism. So they're already don't have as high of a need for oxygen. So that's going to help us. The next example is going to be reptiles, and all reptiles except birds. Remember, birds are evolved from reptiles. Here we have another situation where we have, just like the amphibians, two atrium and only one true ventricle, but there's a partial septum. And we still have the inefficiency of being able to mix deoxygenated, oxygenated blood in the heart. But for these reptiles, they don't have the ability to breathe through the skin, but they do have the ability to submerge and still circulate blood throughout the body. Now, Problem is, they're not going to be able to recharge the oxygen. Instead, what they do is they completely shut off the pulmonary circuit. Amphibians partially would shut it off. Reptiles have the ability to completely shut it off. And they've even added an additional artery coming off the middle of the heart to allow a complete bypass. So there's essentially two aortas, a left aorta and a right aorta, and a pulmonary artery that can be completely turned off when they're submerged. Again, this has its inefficiencies, but it can work for reptiles because remember, they're exothermic. They don't require much oxygen for simply heating up their body. Instead, they just rely on environmental heat in order to do so. So they have a very low metabolism, therefore a low need for oxygen. But the advantages of being able to completely submerged in water and just become fairly static for a while allows them the ability to hunt, but also the ability to hide. So there's some advantages to that. Finally, our last case is what you're probably much more familiar with because this is what mammals have, but this is also what birds have. So even though birds evolved from reptiles, they independently developed really the same type of circulatory system as a mammal. So again, this is an example of convergent evolution, where they didn't come from the same ancestor, but they evolved to serve the same purpose. We already saw how birds have a very efficient respiratory system using air bladders in the front and back so that they can continuously move oxygen through the respiratory, through their lungs. And the mammals and birds have a true double circulation, completely separated, four chambers, two ventricles, two atrium, no integration between the left and right side. So it's extremely efficient. Very high pressures can be generated on the left side. But in this case, the lungs are always going to be operable. There's no time in which you would stop moving blood to the lungs. So it's not necessary to have these bypasses in the heart like we have in amphibians and reptiles. Now, when we look at adaptations, as we get to the four-chambered heart, the true four-chambered heart that we see in mammals and birds, it is very important for supporting endotherms. Remember, endotherms have to generate all their heat from internal production of ATP. Therefore, endoderms require about 10 times more energy than an ectoderm of the same size. Amphibians, reptiles, they're ectotherms. Now, so that's why they don't have to have the highly efficient four-chambered heart. So the evolution of the four-chambered heart came in those animals that had extremely high metabolism, which would be the land-based mammals and the birds. And again, the fact that birds and mammals evolved from completely different ancestors, but they evolved with the same four-chambered hearts is a good example of what we've talked about a few times about convergent evolution. Okay, so that completes this part of the lecture, and I'll see you for the next lecture. Goodbye.